The city had a way of forgetting its own wounds. You could drive past the same crumbling wall every day for 10 years, and never once ask yourself what used to stand behind it, what lives had been contained within it, what histories had been sealed inside when the funding dried up, and the gates were locked, and the signs were taken down, so that even the memory of the place could be quietly erased from the municipal consciousness. The Harrow Park Zoological Gardens had been exactly that kind of wound, a place that the city had decided, collectively and without much ceremony, to simply stop seeing. The iron gates at the main entrance had rusted into a permanent half-open position sometime around 15 years ago, and the weeds had done the rest, creeping up through the cracked pavement, swallowing the old information plaques, pulling the painted wooden signs back down into the earth where they apparently belonged. If you asked most residents about Harrow Park, they would give you a blank look, and then vaguely remember something about a controversy, a funding scandal, an incident that nobody could quite name. And then they would change the subject in the way that people do when they sense that a memory carries more weight than they want to carry. Maya Chen knew about the zoological gardens because her grandmother had taken her there once, when she was 6 years old, and the park was still technically operating on its last reserves of public money. She remembered very little about that visit except for 2 things. The first was the smell, that particular combination of hay and animal musk, and something darker underneath, something that she had not been able to name as a child, but that she now recognized as a kind of accumulated grief, the specific scent of creatures living in spaces too small for them. The second thing she remembered was standing in front of a large enclosure near the back of the park, an enclosure set slightly apart from the others, and feeling with absolute certainty that something inside it was watching her, not the way that bored zoo animals watched visitors out of habit or hunger, something more deliberate, something that understood the act of looking and chose to direct it specifically at her. At 6-year-old Maya, with her red coat and her grandmother's hand around her wrist, out of all the people present that afternoon, she had not been able to see what was in the enclosure. The angle was wrong, or the light was wrong, or whatever lived inside had positioned itself in shadow with a precision that seemed almost intentional, but she had felt it looking at her for the entire duration of their visit. And when her grandmother finally led her away toward the exit, Maya had turned back 3 times to look at the enclosure, and each time she had the sensation that whatever was inside turned with her, tracking her departure with the kind of attention that one usually reserves for things that matter. She was 31 years old now, and she had spent the intervening 25 years becoming a person who understood animals in a professional and practical sense, which was perhaps the most honest thing she could say about her career trajectory. She had a veterinary degree from a university that had been moderately difficult to get into and extremely difficult to stay in. She had 2 years of large animal experience from a practice in the countryside, 2 hours north of the city, and she had a reputation among the volunteer network for being the person you called when the situation was difficult, and the animal in question had decided that the human world could go directly to hell. She was not particularly tall, and she was not particularly imposing, and she did not have the booming, confident voice that some of her colleagues used as a management tool with frightened animals. What she had was something quieter and harder to name, a quality of presence that seemed to communicate to frightened creatures that she was not a threat, that she was not in a hurry, that she was willing to wait as long as the waiting took. The call from the Harrow Park Rescue Initiative had come on a Tuesday morning in October, when the sky was doing that specific gray thing that it does in autumn. The kind of gray that is not quite threatening, but is definitely making a point. The initiative had been established 6 months earlier as a coalition of animal welfare organizations responding to reports that the abandoned zoological gardens still contained living animals, animals that had apparently been surviving in the decaying enclosures for years, some of them born there after the park's closure, none of them with any human care or veterinary attention, subsisting on whatever the surrounding environment could provide them with, and on what the initiative's preliminary assessment had described as circumstances that defy straightforward explanation. Maya had read the preliminary report twice, and the phrase had lodged itself in her mind with the particular stubbornness of things that are clearly a placeholder for something more specific that the writer had decided not to write. She drove to Harrow Park on a Wednesday morning, with the October sky still gray, and a thermos of coffee in the cup holder, and a kit in the back seat that she had packed with more supplies than she would typically need, because the preliminary report had been vague in ways that suggested she might need things she had not anticipated. The iron gates were standing at their permanent half-open angle, the weeds pressing up around them in a way that made them look less like gates and more like ruins, and Maya pulled her car through and parked on what had once been a visitor parking area and was now a surface of cracked asphalt, decorated with determined vegetation. The other volunteers were already there. 3 of them, all people she recognized from the network, all wearing the initiative's gray vests and all, carrying the slightly strained expression of people who had been here long enough to have encountered something that had adjusted their expectations. Petra, who ran the initiative's logistics, met Maya at the car with a clipboard and a look that Maya classified as carefully managed concern. "Good, you're here," Petra said. "We've made progress with most of the animals. There's a family of red pandas in the east enclosure that's almost comfortable with us now, and the birds are largely cooperative. The ungulates were in worse shape than we expected, but Dr. Vasquez has been handling them, and she thinks they'll be ready for transport within the week." Petra paused, and Maya recognized the pause as the kind that contains information that the speaker is organizing into the least alarming possible presentation. "The situation in the north enclosure is different." "Different how?" Maya said. "There is a Siberian tiger in the north enclosure," Petra said. "He was not in any of the original park records that we could find, which is already unusual. The enclosure is structurally sound, which is more than we can say for some of the others, and someone has clearly been maintaining it, although we cannot determine who or how. The tiger is in reasonable physical condition considering the circumstances, which is also something we cannot entirely account for." Another pause. "He will not interact with any of us. He will not take food from any of us. He has attacked the fence twice when approached. And he does not look at any of us." Maya picked up her kit. "You said he doesn't look at any of you. Does he look at anything?" Petra consulted her clipboard, in the way that people sometimes consult clipboards when they want to appear to be double-checking information that they already know. "The overnight camera we set up 2 days ago captured footage of him pacing, which is normal stress behavior for big cats in captivity. But there were also several periods where he stopped pacing and stood facing the entrance to the enclosure area, which is the direction your car would have come from, and just stood there, completely still, for quite long periods." She looked up from the clipboard. "We don't have an explanation for that." Maya thought about a 6-year-old in a red coat, standing in front of an enclosure she couldn't see into, feeling something watching her with the specific weight of deliberate attention. "Show me where he is," she said. The north enclosure was set apart from the others in exactly the way she remembered, though the memory was more feeling than image, more sensation than detail. The path to it wound past enclosures that were now serving as makeshift rehabilitation stations, past the sounds of the other animals in their various stages of adjustment to human presence, past the smell of hay and antiseptic, and that darker undercurrent that Maya had never stopped associating with confined grief. The north enclosure was surrounded by a secondary fence that the initiative had installed as a safety perimeter, and there were warning signs on it in 3 languages. And there was a folding chair positioned outside it that looked like it belonged to someone who had been sitting here watching and trying to figure out what they were watching. Maya stopped at the safety perimeter fence and looked through it at the enclosure beyond. The enclosure was large, significantly larger than she would have expected for a park of this type, with actual terrain inside it, elevated sections, a water feature that appeared to be functioning, trees that had been allowed to grow to a considerable size, and that now created patches of deep shadow even in the gray October morning light. She could not see the tiger. She was aware of him anyway, in the same way she had been aware of something in this enclosure 25 years ago. That quality of directed attention pressing through the air from somewhere in the shadows. "I'm going to go in," she said. Petra made a noise that was not quite an objection, but was working in that direction. "Maya, he attacked the fence twice. We have the footage. He's not responding to any of our standard approaches, and Dr. Vasquez specifically recommended that we not." "I'm not going to use a standard approach," Maya said. "I'm going to sit down. She had learned, over years of working with frightened animals, that the most powerful thing you could offer a creature in distress was the demonstration that you were not a threat, and that the most effective way to demonstrate that you were not a threat was to remove yourself from the behavioral category of things that threatened. Threatened things moved with urgency. They made direct approaches. They used loud voices and confident body language, and they oriented themselves toward the frightened animal with the full intensity of their intent. Maya had found that the inverse of all these things was more useful. She moved slowly, or she didn't move at all. She angled herself to the side rather than facing forward. She kept her voice low when she used it, and often she didn't use it, because silence communicated something that words couldn't. She let herself through the safety perimeter gate, then approached the main enclosure entrance, which was a heavy-duty sliding door on a track that the initiative had reinforced and equipped with a new lock. She could feel the attention from the shadows intensifying as she worked the lock, not the way you feel animal attention as a kind of wariness or professional alertness, but in a way that was harder to categorize, a sense of being recognized rather than simply observed. She pushed the thought aside in the practical-minded way that she pushed aside all thoughts that didn't contribute to the immediate task, and she opened the door and went in. She did not look toward the shadows where she sensed him waiting. She walked to a spot roughly in the center of the enclosure, sat down on the ground cross-legged with her kit beside her, and looked at the ground in front of her feet. Then she waited. The silence of the enclosure was different from the silence outside it. There was the same October wind, the same distant city sounds bleeding through the old walls of the park, but underneath these there was a quality of attention so concentrated that it had a kind of pressure to it, like standing near something with a powerful electromagnetic field. Maya breathed slowly and kept her eyes on the ground and let the silence do its work. Nothing happened for 40 minutes. Maya drank some of her coffee from the thermos and watched a small beetle navigate the cracked ground near her knee, and thought about the preliminary report's phrase about circumstances that defy straightforward explanation, and wondered what it would take to get the water feature properly assessed, because the sound of it in the background, that soft, persistent movement, was either a functional, recirculating pump or something more puzzling, and in either case, it would need to be looked at. She thought about all of these practical things with the part of her mind that she kept available for ordinary thoughts, and with the other part, the quieter part, she remained aware of the presence in the shadows, and of the way that presence had not moved once in 40 minutes, had simply stood there watching her with an intensity that she was beginning to feel in the base of her spine. On the 43rd minute, she heard him move. It was not a sound she would have heard if she had been less attuned to it. A subtle shift of weight on packed earth, the ghost of a footfall. She did not look up. She tracked the movement by sound, and by that other quality of awareness, and she understood from both that he was moving toward her not directly, but in a wide arc, circling, approaching from the side, the way a cautious predator does when curiosity wins a preliminary argument against threat. Assessment. She kept her eyes on the beetle, and her breathing slow, and her body still. He stopped about 12 feet from her. She could hear his breathing now, slow and heavy, and she could smell him, that particular scent of large cat that was part musk and part something older that did not belong entirely to the animal kingdom. She still did not look up. She reached into her kit and removed a piece of the raw meat she had brought, placed it on the ground between them at the midpoint, then returned her hand to her knee. She did not look at the meat. She did not look at him. She looked at the beetle, which had now encountered a crack in the ground, and was working out the geometry of the problem with the focused energy of something that does not have the option of being distracted. Another 4 minutes passed. Then she heard him move again, this time forward, closing the distance, and she heard him lower his head to the meat, and she heard him eat it with the quiet efficiency of an animal that has not been eating enough and knows it, but has been refusing anyway on some principle that mattered more than hunger. When he was done, he did not retreat. He stood at the midpoint where the meat had been, 12 feet closer than he had been before, and Maya looked up. He was enormous. She had known this intellectually from the reports and from her own experience with large cats, but the reality of him at this range was something that the intellectual knowledge had not fully prepared her for. He was the largest Siberian tiger she had ever seen outside of reference photographs, with a heaviness of frame that suggested age and a history of significant physical development. And his coat was remarkable, the usual amber and cream and black markings present, but more complex in their patterning than was typical, as though the pattern had been designed rather than evolved. His eyes were gold, not the amber or yellow that was normal for the species, but a genuine warm gold that caught even the gray October light and held it in a way that seemed to generate its own illumination from inside. And he was covered in scars. Some of them were old enough to have been fully absorbed into his coat, visible only as irregularities in the pattern where fur had grown back differently after injury. Others were newer, or had been newer at some point, healed now but telling a story of violence that had been sustained and deliberate. They ran along his flanks and across his shoulders, and there were several on his face, one of them bisecting his left brow ridge in a way that gave his expression a quality of permanent intensity that was separate from whatever his actual expression was doing at any given moment. His actual expression, as he looked at her, was something she did not have a clean category for. She had spent years learning to read animal faces, learning the specific vocabularies of fear and aggression and curiosity and submission that different species expressed in different configurations of feature and posture. What she was reading on his face now was none of these. Or perhaps some combination of all of them rearranged into something that did not map cleanly onto any of the templates she had built. There was wariness in it, certainly, but there was also something that looked like recognition, which was impossible, and something that looked like grief, which was not impossible but was unexpected. And underneath both of these there was something that looked, against all reasonable interpretation, like relief. They looked at each other for a long moment, the woman sitting cross-legged on the ground, and the scarred tiger standing 12 feet away with the October wind moving through his fur. Then Maya said, very quietly, "Hello." She did not say it in the bright, encouraging voice that people sometimes use with animals, the voice that is really a way of managing one's own discomfort in the presence of something wild. She said it in the same voice she would use to greet a person she did not know well but was glad to see, a voice that meant what it said, and nothing more than what it said. The tiger looked at her for another long moment. Then he lay down. It was not a gesture of submission. It was not the lying down of an animal that has given up or been subdued. It was something much more deliberate, something that communicated a willingness to remain in the present moment without hostility, a choice to acknowledge her presence, without necessarily resolving what it meant. Maya recognized it as one of the more articulate things she had ever seen an animal do, and the part of her mind that she kept for the thoughts she didn't fully examine filed the observation away in a folder marked, "Return to this." She stayed for another hour. She did not approach him further, and she did not offer more food, and she did not try to do any of the assessment work that she would normally have begun moving toward by this point in a first encounter. She sat with him in the October quiet and watched the beetle finish its geometric work and disappear into the crack. And she listened to the water feature's soft circulation, and she was aware of his eyes on her the entire time, steady and gold and full of something she couldn't name, watching her with the concentrated attention of someone who has been waiting for something for a very long time, and is not yet sure whether what has arrived is the thing they were waiting for. When she stood to leave, she saw something shift in his posture, something that she would have called in an animal, in a tiger, in a creature who was by definition unable to feel this specific configuration of things, something she would have called apprehension. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I'll be back tomorrow." She meant it in the practical sense, the professional sense, the sense of a schedule and a rehabilitation plan and the work that needed to be done. But she said it the way she had said hello, in a voice that carried what it carried, and she watched his ears move forward fractionally in response. And then she went back through the door and into the gray October morning that suddenly seemed considerably less gray than it had been 90 minutes ago. If you have ever felt the particular sensation of a story beginning, not a story that you are telling, not a story that you are observing from a comfortable distance, but a story that you are in the middle of, that you are central to, that has been waiting for your arrival to begin, then you understand something of what Maya carried with her out of that enclosure. She could not have articulated it, and she was too practical to try, but she felt it, sitting in her car in the cracked parking lot, with her hands on the steering wheel and her thermos empty in the cup holder and the October wind pushing leaves across the asphalt. She felt with absolute certainty that something had started that would change the shape of everything that came after. She was not wrong. Elias Voss had been in the enclosure for 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days when she walked through the door, though he had stopped counting after the first year because counting was one of the things that had come to feel like a form of self-harm, a way of measuring the distance between what he was and what he had been, that served no purpose except to make the distance feel longer. He had time, in his current form, in quantities, that made the word feel meaningless. He had the enclosure and the sky above it and the water that someone had arranged to keep running. He had the small animals that occasionally came in through gaps in the fence and provided him with what hunting instinct remained present and available to him. He had the slow turning of seasons and the gradual reclamation of the enclosure by the plant life that was not supposed to be there but had come anyway. And he had the curse. He thought of it as the curse, because he had been thinking of it in those terms before it was enacted, when it was still a threat being spoken by a man whose face he had looked at across a conference table in a building in the financial district, and tried to understand how someone could construct such a complete architecture of betrayal while maintaining such a perfect surface of alliance. Roan Ashford, who had been his family's human liaison for 6 years, and who had learned in that time everything there was to know about the Voss line's specific vulnerabilities, including the oldest and least comfortable one, that the Voss bloodline carried within it a dormant strand of ancient magic that under the right conditions of psychological extremity could be turned against the carrier, used to lock the shift in a way that no amount of willpower or training could reverse. The right conditions of psychological extremity, in Elias's case, had been created by Roan with considerable precision. The betrayal had been constructed in layers, each layer more damaging than the last, each one designed to produce a specific type of wound. The alliance that Roan had spent 6 years building between the Voss line and the network of human power brokers who knew about the supernatural world was not an alliance. It had been a long project of intelligence gathering, a systematic documentation of the Voss family's territories, their relationships, their vulnerabilities, their secrets, assembled piece by piece through 6 years of apparent loyalty and delivered to the faction that wanted those territories and had been willing to pay for the information needed to take them. When it was over, when the dust of the various crises that followed had settled into something like a new arrangement, Roan's faction was in control of what the Voss line had built, and Elias was here, locked into his animal form by the oldest magic in his bloodline, in an enclosure in an abandoned park at the edge of a city that did not know. He existed. The other shifters who came to look at him in the first months, because there were others, representatives of other lines, people who had been adjacent to the collapse of the Voss power structure, and who came to satisfy themselves that Elias was as thoroughly contained as they had been told. He did not attack them through the fence, though he could have. He understood that attacking them would provide information about his capabilities that he would rather withhold. He simply did not look at them. He treated them as he would have treated meaningless features of the landscape, rocks or stumps, and watched them try to read something into his stillness and fail, and eventually leave, and not come back. The humans who eventually found the park and began their rescue operation were simpler. They were genuinely what they appeared to be, people who cared about animals in the straightforward way that did not require any complicated interpretation, and their fear and their caution when they approached his enclosure was honest and proportionate, and he felt nothing in particular about it. He did not eat what they offered because he did not want them to interpret it as cooperation, as a signal that they were making progress, as an indication that the situation was moving toward the kind of resolution that would result in him being moved somewhere else, and examined and identified in ways that would cause significant problems. He stayed still, and he did not look at them, and he waited for them to conclude that he was unmanageable, and either leave him alone or make a decision that he would deal with when it was made. He was not prepared for her. He had been aware of her before she arrived. This was not something he could explain in terms that would make sense to someone who did not carry the specific awareness that came with his bloodline. But the Voss line had always had a quality of extended perception, a sensitivity to certain kinds of approaching, significance that operated below the threshold of ordinary consciousness. He had felt it 2 nights before she came, standing at the place in the enclosure where the terrain elevated slightly and gave him a sight line to the area beyond the park's eastern wall, standing there in the dark with his nose in the wind and his whole being oriented toward something that was not yet there but was coming. He did not know what it was. He knew only that it mattered, in the specific way that the word mattered could mean everything from requires attention to changes everything, and that he would not know which of those it was until it arrived. When she walked through the door, he understood immediately, with the clarity that sometimes comes with the thing you have been sensing before it takes shape, that the second meaning was the accurate one. She was not remarkable in the way that people sometimes are when they first encounter someone from a supernatural bloodline. No particular reaction to the concentrated awareness he directed at her, no visible discomfort, none of the subliminal communication of danger that most humans received and acted on without knowing they were receiving it. She walked in and sat down and looked at the ground, and she was still in the way that told him she was choosing the stillness. Not that she didn't know how to move, not that she was frozen. She was still the way water is still in a deep place. He circled her for 43 minutes. He had meant to circle her indefinitely, had meant to maintain the same refusal he had maintained with everyone else. But the 43-minute mark arrived, and he found that he had been moving toward her for several steps before the decision to do so had registered consciously. He stopped 12 feet from her and looked at her properly, the way he had not looked at anything from the outside world in 3 years and 4 months, and however many days it had been since he stopped counting. And he read her the way he could read people in this form, with the full animal apparatus of perception laid over the older and stranger awareness that had always been his inheritance. She was not afraid of him. Not in the way that was suppressed fear. Not in the way that was professional competence overriding an instinctive response. She was genuinely not afraid. And the absence of fear was not the absence of recognition. She knew exactly what he was in the categorical sense, an apex predator of considerable size in an enclosed space. But she had placed that recognition in some context that neutralized its threat potential, had decided something about him that the information alone did not require deciding. He did not know what the decision was. He knew only that it had been made, and that it had nothing in it of the condescension or the projected safety that people sometimes brought to frightened animals, nothing of the professional management of a situation. She had looked at him. In the 43 minutes he had been circling, with no particular need for him to be anything other than what he was. He ate the meat. He hated himself slightly for eating the meat, because it was an admission, a fracture in the consistent position he had maintained. But his hunger was real, and the hunger was starting to affect his thinking in ways he could not afford. And the meat was placed without expectation or performance. Placed, and then simply left there as an offered fact, and he ate it. When she looked up, and they met each other's eyes for the first time, something happened that he was entirely unwilling to name. He was aware of it the way you are aware of a large structural shift in something you have been assuming was fixed. Not a collapse, not a catastrophe, but a settling into a different configuration. The ground finding a new level. Her eyes were dark brown and entirely steady, and they looked at him with the same quality of decided recognition that the rest of her presence communicated, and underneath the practical veterinary assessment that he could see her performing, there was something else, something that was personal rather than professional, that looked at him as though it had been looking for him specifically. He lay down. It was the closest thing to a white flag that he had in his current repertoire, and he deployed it not because he surrendered anything, but because continuing to stand felt like a form of dishonesty, felt like maintaining a position for the sake of maintenance rather than because the position reflected anything true. He lay down and he watched her, and she watched the ground, and they existed in the enclosure together for another hour, in a quiet that was different from every other quiet he had inhabited in the past 3 years, because this one had something in it other than absence. When she left, He felt the enclosure contract slightly around him. He lay where he had been lying after she went through the door and listened to the sounds of her moving away through the park, her footfalls receding, the distant sound of a car door, an engine, diminishing. When the sounds were fully gone, he stood and walked to the center of the enclosure, to the spot where she had sat, and lowered his head to the ground where she had been. He breathed in what remained there, that particular combination of antiseptic and coffee, and something underneath those things that was just her, the specific olfactory signature of a specific person, and he held it in his awareness with the same precision with which he had been holding his anger and his refusal for 3 years and 4 months, and he let something very small and very important shift. She came back the next day, and the day after that. If you are enjoying this story, and you can feel it doing something to you, that particular thing that a story does when it catches somewhere inside you, and you realize you've stopped being a passive observer and started caring. What happens next? Please hit the like button below because it helps this channel reach more people who are looking for exactly this kind of story, and leave a comment telling me what you're feeling right now, whether it's hope or worry, or that specific combination of the two that comes when you sense that something beautiful is assembling itself out of very difficult material. The days had a structure that Maya found herself organizing around with more investment than professional necessity required. She would arrive in the morning, park in the cracked lot, make her way through the park past the other enclosures where the rehabilitation work was proceeding through its various stages, and then she would go to the north enclosure and let herself in and sit down and begin the day's work of being present without demanding anything from the presence she was present with. She brought food every day, different proteins, not in the variety of someone trying to find the right incentive, but in the variety of someone building a picture of preference, and she noted what he chose and what he left, and added it to the growing document of observations that she was building for the initiative's records. The observations were thorough and professionally constructed, and they contained everything that her official capacity required them to contain. They did not contain the other observations, the ones that did not belong in a veterinary assessment, the ones that accumulated in a separate part of her attention like water gathering in a low place. The way he looked at her was the primary one, that quality of deliberate attention that she had felt at 6 years old, and that she was now experiencing at its full adult intensity, and that she was increasingly unable to interpret as simply the fixed gaze of an animal tracking a source of food or potential threat. It was too articulate for that. It contained too much variation, too much responsiveness, too many subtle adjustments that corresponded to specific moments in their interactions in ways that seemed to require a quality of understanding that the category animal did not fully contain. There was the morning she arrived upset about a phone call she had received before leaving the house, a call from the landlord of her apartment building about a lease issue that was going to be more complicated than she had anticipated, and she had been carrying it poorly, the upset sitting in her shoulders and her jaw in the way that upset does when you are trying to suppress it through the ordinary mechanisms, and the ordinary mechanisms are not quite succeeding. She had sat down in the enclosure and tried to move into the usual quality of stillness, and found that the upset was making the stillness unavailable. After a few minutes, she gave up on suppressing it and simply said out loud, "I'm having a bad morning. Sorry," addressed to no one in particular, and everyone present, which was to say, addressed to him. He had been lying in his usual position, the one he had settled into over the course of the first week, a spot maybe 8 feet from where she sat, that was close enough to communicate willingness to be present, and far enough to avoid the category of proximity that would require both of them to have resolved something that had not yet been resolved. When she said the words, he raised his head. Not the way an animal raises its head in response to a sound, the quick, alert reorientation of attention. He raised his head slowly, deliberately, and looked at her, and the look contained something she would have described, in a person, as concern, the intentional kind of concern, the kind that asks what's wrong and is prepared to hear the answer. Maya looked back at him, and the upset in her shoulders loosened slightly, and she said, "I have a landlord who is being difficult," and felt somewhat ridiculous speaking it aloud to a tiger, and then felt less ridiculous than she expected to feel, because he continued to look at her with the expression she was not naming yet, and she found herself talking. She told him about the landlord and about the lease, and about the fact that her apartment had always been just barely adequate, and that the idea of having to move added to everything else was, this morning, more weight than she wanted to carry. She talked for maybe 10 minutes, not in the way she would have talked to a therapist or a friend, not with the specific narrative arc of complaint, but in the more diffuse way that you talk when you are simply releasing pressure, when the audience is less important than the act of speaking. He listened with his head raised and his gold eyes steady on her face. And when she finished talking and said, "Anyway, thank you for listening," she was aware that she meant it with a sincerity that the word "anyway" was not quite capacious enough to hold. He stood up and walked toward her, and stopped at a distance of 3 feet, which was the closest he had come, and looked at her for a long moment from that reduced distance. And then he lay down again, closer than he had been before. Maya looked at the 3-foot gap between them, and felt something that she filed in the same folder as everything else she was not yet examining, and she went back to the morning's work. By the end of the 2nd week, the 3-foot gap had become a question that the space between them was quietly asking, and neither of them had yet formally answered. He moved closer, in increments that were small enough to be deniable, as purposeful, but cumulative enough to be unmistakable as a direction. She did not close the distance from her side, not because she was waiting strategically, but because she understood instinctively that this was his movement to make, that the closing of the distance was a form of speech that he needed to deliver in his own syntax and at his own pace, and her job was to remain available to receive it without imposing the grammar of her own needs on the delivery. She was a veterinarian. She had professional protocols and ethical frameworks, and a clear sense of the line between the clinical relationship with an animal under her care and everything on the other side of that line. She was aware of the line. She was aware that some of the things she was feeling stood at the line's edge and looked at it with an expression that she was not currently investigating. She was also aware, because she was rigorously honest with herself about the data her own perceptions generated, that what was happening in the North Enclosure was not adequately described by any of the professional frameworks she had available to her, that it had a quality of happening that those frameworks could contain at the surface level, but not at the level of what it meant, and that the question of what it meant was one she was going to have to address eventually, even though addressing it would require her to engage with a set of implications that were, to put it plainly, fairly extraordinary. The thing that pushed her toward addressing it earlier than she might have otherwise was the night she saw him pace. She had returned to the enclosure after dark on a Thursday in the 3rd week, for reasons that she described to herself as professional. She had left a piece of equipment inside that she needed for an early assessment the next morning, and had not expected to see what she saw through the fence before she reached the main entrance. He was pacing. Not the habitual pacing of a stressed captive animal, which she knew well, and which had its own particular rhythm, its own exhausted mechanical quality. This was different. It had the quality of thought. He moved through the space of the enclosure with a deliberateness that suggested he was working something out, that the movement was in service of a mental process, rather than an expression of aimless anxiety. And as she watched, he stopped pacing and turned to face the direction of the entrance, in the way Petra had described from the overnight camera footage, and stood there completely still. And she understood with the particular quality of understanding that bypasses all the intermediate steps and goes directly to the conclusion, that he was standing there because she was there, that some awareness in him had registered her presence outside the fence before she had made any sound, had oriented to her the way a compass orients to north, with the accuracy of something that has a relationship to the thing it points toward rather than simply a proximity. She stood outside the fence for a long time, watching him watch the direction she was standing in the dark, through the chain link, and the distance between them. And she let herself know what she knew. She let the folder labeled, "Return to This," open, and she examined its contents with the honest attention they deserved. And she identified in her own experience the following. She thought about him consistently. Across the hours, she was not in the enclosure. She had rearranged 2 other professional commitments in the past week to preserve her morning time at the park. She felt something shift in her every morning when she went through the enclosure door, something that she experienced as a kind of homecoming, which was a word she would not have applied to any other professional situation in her life. And she was standing outside a fence in the dark, in October, in a park that did not officially exist. On current city maps, watching a tiger stand completely still facing the direction she was standing in, and she felt, underneath all of the complications and the questions and the things that did not make sense, underneath all of that, she felt entirely right. Not right as in correct, though that too. Right as in complete. Right as in arrived. She unlocked the gate and went in. He was still facing the direction of the entrance when she came through the door, and she watched the moment he saw her, watched the stillness of his posture change into something that was still, but was differently still, was still with intention rather than with waiting, and she walked to her usual spot and sat down, and she said quietly, into the dark and the October cold, "I know something is happening. I'm not in a hurry for it to be anything in particular, but I want you to know that I'm paying attention." He walked to her and lay down beside her, not at 3 feet, not at the careful, incremental distance that had been the language of the past 2 weeks. He lay down at a distance of about 12 inches, close enough that she could feel the warmth that came off him, that immense animal warmth, close enough that when the wind shifted, she could breathe in that particular complex of scents that she had begun to associate specifically with him and no other thing in the world. She sat very still. She breathed. She placed her hand, very carefully, palm down, on the ground between them, not reaching toward him, simply placing it there as an offered fact, available if he chose to acknowledge it, retractable if he did not. He pressed his head into her hand. If you have ever touched something and felt, through the touching, that you were receiving as much as you were giving, that the contact was going both ways in ways that contact does not always go, that you were being known in the same moment you were knowing, then you have some approximation of what Maya experienced in that moment, kneeling on the cold ground of an abandoned enclosure in the dark, with the largest and most extraordinary animal she had ever encountered, pressing his enormous scarred head into her hand, and looking up at her with eyes that she now understood were not amber or yellow or gold exactly, but were the color of something seen through fire, lit from a source that fire had not originally been expected to illuminate. "What are you?" she whispered. He looked at her. The gold eyes were direct and full, and there was something in them now that she could not call animal at all, something that the word animal was simply not large enough to hold. And she held his gaze and let the question she had asked vibrate in the air between them and land wherever it was going to land, and she waited for whatever answer was available to her. He blinked, slowly, in the way that big cats communicate trust, and then he made a sound that was not quite a growl, and not quite a purr, and not quite a word, a sound that was somewhere in the territory between all three. And Maya sat in the dark with her hand against his head, and felt the sound move through her in the way that music moves through you, when it finds the exact frequency of something you have been carrying without knowing you were carrying it. She did not go home that night. She sat with him in the dark until the October cold became the October near dawn, and he lay beside her with his head close to her hand, and the sky above the open top of the enclosure moved through its darkness and its gradual lightening, and at some point before the light was fully established, she fell asleep sitting against the enclosure wall, and when she woke, he had positioned himself so that she was leaning against his side, and the warmth of him had kept the cold away. And she woke with the specific quality of waking that comes when the first thing you become aware of, before memory and identity and the ordinary architecture of daily life reassemble themselves, is that you are not alone, and that the not aloneness is a good thing. The curse had 3 layers. Elias had known this the way you know the structure of a thing that has been done to you, not through study or explanation, but through the direct experience of its architecture pressing against your interior, which is an intimate and unpleasant kind of knowledge. The first layer was the straightforward lock on the shift, the mechanism that held him in his animal form and denied him access to the human one. The second layer was the isolation, which was not exactly a clause in the curse, so much as a consequence of the first layer enforced by design, without the capacity for speech, without the form that would make human interaction possible. Any connection he might form with another person was necessarily limited in ways that served the interests of those who wanted him contained and forgotten. The third layer was the one he thought about least, because thinking about it was the most painful, which was the knowledge of what he had lost. Not the power, or the position, or the territory, though those losses were real and had their own specific weight. What he had lost, what the curse had been designed to make him lose most thoroughly, was the sense of himself as someone in relationship with the world, someone embedded in a web of accountability and care and shared purpose. The curse had made him nothing but himself, which was a sentence that sounded like freedom, until you lived it and understood that a self without relational context is a kind of solitary confinement that no physical enclosure can fully replicate. He had not known that connection could break the curse. He had not thought about breaking the curse in terms of something someone else could offer him, because he had spent 3 years and 4 months constructing a psychology that did not require anything from anyone, that was sealed against the particular vulnerability of needing. But the curse's architecture, which he understood better than anyone who had not had it enacted upon them, had a fault line in it that Roan's faction had apparently not considered, or had considered and dismissed as theoretical. The fault line was this: the lock operated on isolation. It required, for its maintenance, that the consciousness imprisoned in the animal form remain isolated from genuine mutual recognition, from the specific quality of being known by another person in a way that they also knew. You. Not love in the romantic sense, necessarily, though that was the most powerful version of the energy involved. The quality of real encounter. The moment when two beings look at each other and recognize each other specifically, not categorically, not as human or animal or threat or opportunity, but as themselves, as the irreducible particular persons they were. The fault line had been opening since the first day she sat down in the center of the enclosure and looked at the beetle on the ground and did not perform anything for him, did not manage anything, did not reduce herself to a function. It had been opening every morning when she came through the door, and the enclosure's quality of atmosphere changed simply because she was in it. It had been opening in every quiet hour, and every piece of offered food, and every word she said to him as though he understood, which he did, which she somehow knew, which was itself one of the more significant fault line events. And on the night she pressed her hand against the cold ground, and he pressed his head into it. The fault line did not dramatically fracture. It is not in the nature of the deepest changes to announce themselves with drama, but it shifted, substantially, in a direction that could not be shifted back. The problem was that the opening of the fault line had not gone unnoticed. Roan's faction had mechanisms in place for monitoring the curse's integrity. Elias had suspected this for some time. Suspected that, his continued containment was not entirely self-sustaining, that someone was checking the structural elements periodically, because the alternative, that they trusted the curse to hold indefinitely without attention, seemed inconsistent with the thoroughness that had characterized the entire operation of his destruction. What he had not known was the sensitivity of those mechanisms, had not known that they were calibrated to register even preliminary structural shifts in the isolation layer, had not known that the first morning Maya sat down in his enclosure and looked at him with those dark, steady eyes, and made a decision about him that no categorical assessment of danger could have produced was noted, somewhere in Roan Ashford's world, as an anomaly requiring investigation. He found this out on a Sunday morning in November, when he was lying in the enclosure waiting for her to arrive, and instead of her footsteps, he heard different footsteps, multiple sets, moving through the park with the specific quality of movement that belonged to people who knew about the supernatural world and were comfortable operating in it. The particular unhurried deliberateness of people who were not afraid of what they might find because they had arranged for it to be there. There were 4 of them. He smelled them before they came into the safety perimeter, reading the complex of information that olfactory perception provided in his current form. 2 human males, one human female and one other. That was more complicated. That carried the signature of a shifted bloodline under its human presentation, a bloodline he recognized with a cold precision that was not surprise so much as the confirmation of a thing suspected. The fourth member of the group was from the Ashford family. Not Roan himself, but one of the lieutenants, a younger one whose name Elias thought was Marcus, who had been at the table on the day of the conference room confrontation, and who had looked at Elias with the particular expression of someone who has been told to show no expression and is only partially successful. They came to the safety perimeter and stopped. They did not come inside it. They were there. Elias understood immediately, not to do anything yet, but to assess, to take the measure of what the monitoring had reported and make a judgment about urgency. He lay in the far section of the enclosure, in a patch of shadow, and he was completely still, and he did not look at them, which was not the same as not being aware of them. He was aware of them with every sense he had, tracking the conversation that was conducted in low voices that they probably believed he couldn't hear, but that he could, with perfect clarity. "This is the one," the human female said. She had a quality of authority in her voice that suggested she was the ranking member of this group, which was interesting information about how seriously Roan's faction was taking the monitoring report. They had sent someone capable, not someone peripheral. The monitoring shows a fault line in the isolation matrix. It's been developing for approximately 3 weeks. "How significant is the fault line?" one of the human males said. "Significant enough to require a decision," the woman said. "The question is whether we handle it here or whether we let the situation develop to the point where we can assess what we're actually dealing with. If someone has genuinely breached the isolation matrix by forming a recognized connection with him, removing the person will not repair the fault line. The damage is already done. What it will do is prevent the connection from developing to the point where the matrix fractures entirely." Silence. Then Marcus, the Ashford lieutenant, said, "Roan wants to know about the woman, the veterinarian." "What does he want to know?" the woman asked. "Whether she knows. Whether she's a problem." Another silence, this one longer and with more texture. Then the woman said, "She doesn't know anything. She's a civilian with an unusual quality of presence and no information about what she's dealing with. Whether she becomes a problem depends on what we decide here." He heard everything she did not say in the pause that followed. He heard the operational vocabulary of a faction that had not survived this long through hesitation, that had learned to prevent problems through the specific method of addressing them before they fully became problems. He heard it and felt the cold that he had not felt in anything since arriving in the enclosure. Not the October cold, not the physical, environmental cold, but the cold that belongs to the category of threat directed at specific people you have specific feelings about, which was a sentence that contained more information about his current internal state than he had intended to articulate even to himself. He would not let them touch her. This was not a resolution that he arrived at through reasoning. It was simply present, as complete and solid as anything he had ever known. A foundational fact about the current situation that organized everything else around it. He could not speak, and he could not shift, and he could not walk out of the enclosure and put himself between her and this threat in any of the ways that would have been available to him if the curse were not what it was. What he had was the enclosure, and the animal form, and the fault line that was apparently opening in the isolation matrix. And he had the understanding that the fault line was connected to her, that it was her presence, and specifically what her presence created in him, that was wearing away at the architecture of his containment, and that if anything was going to change about his situation in time to be relevant, it was going to be connected to her. He waited until Roan's people had gone, listening to their footsteps recede until they were entirely beyond the range of even his current perception, and then he moved to the spot where Maya usually sat, and he lay down in it, and he pressed his face to the ground where she had been, and he breathed in what remained of her, and held it in his awareness against the cold that the morning had become. She arrived 40 minutes later. She came through the door with her kit and her thermos, and she stopped just inside the entrance when she saw him lying in her usual spot, and she looked at him with her head slightly tilted in the way she did when she was reading something carefully. And Then she crossed to him and sat down right next to where he was lying, close enough that their proximity had a quality of deliberateness that was different from the proximity they had been building toward. Something more urgent and less measured. "Something is wrong," she said. It was not a question. He looked at her. The gold eyes were direct, and there was something in them that he recognized as the expression he had been carrying since the early morning. The cold, specific quality of someone who has understood a threat and is measuring the distance between the threat and the thing it's directed at. She looked back at him, and he watched her read it, watched her move through the information his expression contained, and arrive at whatever she was going to do with it. And what she did with it was lean forward and put both her hands on his face, framing it the way you frame the face of someone you are about to say something important to, and look directly into his eyes from a distance of about 8 inches and say, "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out." The "we" in that sentence was the most significant thing Elias Voss had heard in 3 years and 4 months. It was not the word itself. It was the assumption behind it, the automatic and uncalculated assumption that they were a unit with a shared problem, that the solving of the problem belonged to both of them, that she had arrived at this conclusion without being told anything about the problem, simply from the evidence of his face and her own sense of the situation. He had been the heir to a significant supernatural dynasty, and he had sat across tables from the most sophisticated human and supernatural political operators of his world, and he had in his life received a great many communications that were intended to convey alliance and partnership. None of them had felt like this sentence, delivered by a woman with both her hands on his face in November cold, looking at him as though he were a person she intended to stand with. Something cracked open in the isolation matrix. Not metaphorically, he felt it physically, felt the layer of the curse that operated on his aloneness register the quality of what had just been communicated between them, and develop a fracture that was larger and more consequential than anything that had happened in the preceding weeks. He felt it the way you feel a bone that has been set wrong, finally finding its correct position, the particular combination of pain and relief that comes with a correction of something that has been wrong for a very long time. He could not tell her what had happened. He could not explain the curse or the faction or the fault line or the cold calculation that was happening somewhere in Roan Ashford's world about the woman sitting in front of him. He could not tell her that she was in danger because of him, that her presence in his life, which had become something he held with more care than he had held anything in the past 3 years, had made her visible to people who addressed visibility by removing it. He could not say any of these things. What he could do was stay alive to her. What he could do was let the connection between them continue to develop with the full weight of what he was, not managed or concealed or reduced to what was safe, but actual and present and real in the way that real things wear away the structures that confine them. He could let the fault line open. He could trust that if anything in his situation was going to change, it was going to change because of her, and that what she deserved from him in return was the full truth of what he was, once he had the capacity to offer it. He pressed his forehead against her hands, and closed his eyes, and let the November morning be what it was. The week before everything changed, Maya had a conversation with Petra that shifted the shape of what she understood about the situation she was in. Petra had been managing the initiative's operations with her usual organized competence, but Maya had noticed in the past 2 weeks a quality of tension in the logistics coordinator that had not been present earlier, a specific alertness in her manner of moving through the park that was different from the baseline alertness that the work required. She raised it with Petra on a Wednesday morning over coffee in the initiative's temporary office, a converted corner of the former park administration building directly. "There have been people here," Maya said. "Not from the initiative." Petra set down her coffee mug. She looked at Maya with the expression of someone who has been maintaining a containment position for some time and is calculating whether the containment is still serving its purpose. Then she said, "Yes. Who are they?" "I don't know specifically," Petra said, which Maya registered as the precise truth within a larger evasion. "They've been here 3 times. Always at night or early morning, always before our volunteers arrive. I found evidence of the most recent visit on Friday, Tire tracks in the lot that weren't ours, and someone had been at the north perimeter. Not inside, but at the outside fence. Maya was very still. What are they interested in? Petra looked at her for a moment. Then she said, Maya, what do you know about what's in that enclosure? I know what I've observed, Maya said, which is a Siberian tiger in exceptional condition who has demonstrated behavioral patterns that are significantly outside the normal range for his species. Outside the normal range for his species, Petra repeated. That's a careful description. It's an accurate one. I've been doing this work for 11 years, Petra said. I've encountered unusual animals. I've encountered animals with histories that required unusual explanations. What is in that enclosure is outside my experience. She picked up her coffee mug again and held it without drinking from it. The people who have been visiting are not animal welfare workers. They are aware of what's in the enclosure, and I do not believe their interest in it is benign. Maya absorbed this. She sat with it for several seconds, running through the practical implications. And then she said, I need to know everything you know. Everything you've observed, everyone you've spoken to, every record that exists about that enclosure and its history. I need to know it today. What Petra knew was fragmentary but significant. The enclosure had not been in the original park plans. It appeared in city records about 14 years ago, added to the park's documentation in a way that was bureaucratically irregular enough to be noticed, but not so irregular as to trigger formal inquiry. The park's former director, who had died 4 years ago in circumstances that the official record described as accidental, had made 2 attempts in his final year to report something to the city's parks administration about the north enclosure, attempts that had been logged and then apparently lost in the system. There was a name in the former director's personal papers, which his daughter had donated to a local archive, and which Petra had accessed when establishing the initiative. Rowan Ashford. The name appeared twice in the director's notes, without context, with a question mark the second time. Maya went home that evening and searched the name. Rowan Ashford had a public profile that was described in professional terms, a senior partner in a consulting firm that appeared to work primarily with governmental and institutional clients, boards and advisory roles, philanthropic affiliations, the kind of profile that communicated significant influence through what it didn't say as much as what it did, the profile of someone who operated in the spaces between institutional structures rather than within them. She found a photograph. He was in his mid-50s, well-maintained in the way of people with resources and attention to presentation, with an expression in the photograph that was entirely neutral in a way that, once she had identified it, she could not stop noticing. The absence of any legible feeling, not the blankness of someone photographed in an unguarded moment, but the cultivated absence of someone who has learned to present nothing, because presenting nothing is a form of protection. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she went back to the park. It was after 9 in the evening. The park was dark and quiet. The other. Animals settled, the initiative's volunteers long since gone. She went through the north enclosure's gates and found him awake, as she had somehow known he would be, lying with his head up and his gold eyes oriented toward the door as she came through it. She sat down close to him, closer than she typically started, and she looked at him for a moment. And then she said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand that I'm not saying it to put pressure on you. I'm saying it because I think you deserve to know that I know it. He was completely still and completely present. Someone named Rowan Ashford has some kind of claim on this enclosure, and on you specifically, she said. I don't know the full story, but I know he has been sending people here to watch, and I know from the way this enclosure was added to city records that the situation is not what it appears to be on the surface. And I know, she paused. She had not permitted herself to say this until now. Had kept it in the folder, and she took it out of the folder and said it. I know that you are not only what I can see. I know that the behavioral evidence does not support the category I've been placing you in. I know that there is more to understand, and I'm telling you that I want to understand it, and that I'm not going to walk away from this enclosure or from you while there's something here that needs to be addressed. He stood up and walked to her, and sat down directly in front of her, which he had never done before, never positioned himself in the direct face-to-face orientation that in animal communication carries its own specific weight. He sat in front of her, and he looked at her, and she looked at him. And in the space between their looking, something was communicated that neither of them could have entirely articulated, but both of them entirely understood. The kind of communication that happens below language, and below even the particular symbolic system of gesture and posture that constitutes its own language. The kind that happens at the level of what two beings simply are when they are in the same space and choose to see each other fully. She put her hand on his head, and he leaned into it, and she felt the warmth of him, and the weight of him, and the extraordinary aliveness of him, and she said, very quietly, "I'm here." The isolation matrix, which had been cracking for weeks, fractured. She felt it before she understood what she was feeling. A shift in the quality of the air around them. A change in what the physical space of the enclosure contained. Not dramatic, not accompanied by visible light or sound or any of the theatrical signals that these moments have in stories. It was more like watching a block of ice find the temperature at which it becomes water. A transformation that is complete and fundamental, and that could not have been predicted from looking at the ice at any point before the moment of change, except in retrospect. She felt the shift, and she felt him, and then she felt something else. A presence in the room that was not the tiger, and was not her. A presence that was gathering itself out of the air, the way certain kinds of fog gather. Not from an external source, but from the conditions that have always been present, waiting for the right configuration. And then, she was not alone with a tiger. She was alone with Elias. He was on his knees on the ground in front of her, which was the position he had ended up in, which was the position the change had found him in. And he was breathing hard in the way that someone breathes after something has been held back for a very long time and is finally let through. And he was looking at her, and his eyes were gold, exactly as gold as they had always been. The one thing that had not changed. For a moment, neither of them moved. Maya looked at him, and he looked at her, and the enclosure held them in its November silence. And she experienced the particular quality of astonishment. That is not frightening, that does not have in it the quality of recoil, but that fills the space of the body, the way deep breaths fill it. The kind of astonishment that is also recognition, that says I did not know this was possible, and I also somehow knew. "Hello," she said, which was exactly the right word. "Hello," he said, and his voice was rough with 3 years and 4 months of silence, rough with everything it had been holding, and she heard in it the shape of who he was in the same way she had been reading who he was for weeks. The same precision and the same depth, now with language on top of it, now with the instrument of speech added to everything else. And she thought that she had never heard a single word carry as much weight as the one he had just said. Then she said, because she was Maya, and because she had never been someone who managed situations at the expense of honesty, "I have a lot of questions." He almost smiled. The muscles of his face were doing something. That would become a smile when he was less overwhelmed by his current circumstances. And she watched them working toward it, and felt something turn over in her chest, with a warmth that was not entirely unlike what she had felt when she woke up that night, leaning against his side with the cold kept away from her. "I have answers," he said. "Most of them are complicated. I have time," she said. He looked at her. Gold eyes steady and full and entirely present. "Maya," he said, and the way he said, her name told her that he had known it, that he had been carrying it in the form that he had been carrying it in, as the weight at the center of a silence he could not break, and he said it now with the force of all of that accumulated carrying. "There are people who are going to notice that this happened." "I know," she said. "They are going to consider you a threat," he said, "because you are one, because of what you did here, whether you intended to or not." "I'm aware," she said. "Tell me what I need to know," he told her. He started at the beginning and went through all of it. The lineage and the alliance, and the 6 years of Roan's project, and the conference room and the curse and the enclosure, and the 3 years and 4 months of what the enclosure had been. and he told her all of it in the rough voice that was finding its way back to itself as he talked, smoothing out slowly the way a path that has been unused becomes a path again when people begin to walk it. She listened, without interrupting, which was how she listened to everything, with the quality of full reception that she had demonstrated since the first day. And when he was done, she sat for a moment in the accumulated weight of everything he had told her, and then she said, "What does Roan Ashford want to happen now that the curse has broken? He wants to ensure that I don't reclaim what was taken," Elias said. "The territories, the relationships with the human contacts, the political position. If I resurface, the entire structure of what he built on top of the Voss line's destruction becomes vulnerable. He will want to address that before I have the opportunity to make it vulnerable." "How does he typically address things?" Maya said. Elias looked at her, with considerable thoroughness. She nodded. She was thinking. He could see her thinking. That specific quality of concentration that he had been watching for weeks, without the benefit of the words she was using to do the thinking. "Okay," she said. "I know some people." He blinked. "What kind of people?" "The kind that deal with situations that don't fit standard frameworks," she said. "The kind you build a network with over years when you work with animals that turn out not to be exactly what they appear." She looked at him steadily. "You're not the first unusual situation I've encountered. You're the most unusual. But I'm not entirely without resources." He looked at her for a long moment. He had built a life before. On competence, his own and others, on the practical management of sophisticated threats and complex alliances, and the political architecture of a world that existed alongside the ordinary one. He had never, in that life, received an offer of help that felt as clean as this one. "Why?" he said. "Not, what do you want?" and not, "what's in it for you?" and not the political calculation of an exchange of goods. Just, why? "Because you deserve to get your life back," she said, simply, in the same voice she used for everything that was true. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should tell you something about the fault line, about what the curse required to break." "Tell me," she said. "It required genuine mutual recognition," he said carefully, "the kind that the isolation matrix operated on the premise that a specific kind of connection would be sufficient to fracture it. A connection in which two people see each other as they actually are, specifically." He paused. "It's the closest thing my line's magic has to what other traditions call a recognized bond. I don't want you to feel that anything between us was produced by external forces. It wasn't. The fault line was opened by what you brought to this enclosure every morning for weeks. And I need you to understand that I was aware of what was happening the entire time, and I chose not to stop it, which was, for me, given the past 3 years, its own kind of declaration." She looked at him for a long time. The gold eyes, the scars, the rough voice that was working its way back to itself, the presence that she had been feeling and naming and carefully not examining for weeks, and that she was now looking at directly without the folder marked "Return to this" between them. "So what you're telling me," she said, "is that the tiger who pressed his head into my hand in the dark knew exactly what he was doing." "Yes," he said, "and that I apparently also knew what I was doing." "Also yes." "Good," she said, and something in her settled, with the quality of a decision that had already been made being formally acknowledged. And she looked at him, and for the first time in a very long time, he looked back at someone without the weight of his containment between his looking and what he was looking at, and the enclosure in November held them in it together, warm with the specific warmth of something that has been cold for a long time, and has finally found the temperature it was always meant to be. If the complexity of what they're facing together is resonating with you, leave a comment below. I want to know if you see hope in this story or if you're bracing for what's coming, because honestly, the answer is both, and that's exactly where we need to be right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do, because the next part of this story is going to require witnesses. What followed was 3 weeks of a different kind of work. The network that Maya had referred to was real, assembled over 6 years of encounters with animals that turned out not to be exactly what they appeared, each encounter adding 1 or 2 people to a loosely maintained web of trust that had never before needed to be activated as a unified force. There was Dr. Reyes, who ran a large animal practice in the northern part of the county, and who had managed 3 situations involving shifted individuals who had lost their way back to human form. There was Jameson, who described himself as a complications consultant, and whose actual work, as far as Maya had been able to determine over 4 years of occasional collaboration, involved navigating the specific kinds of complications that arose at the border between the ordinary world and the one adjacent to it. There was Councilwoman Okafor, who sat on the city's planning committee and who had, on 2 occasions, proven willing to ask questions about irregularities in municipal records that required answers from people who would have preferred not to be asked. And there was Maya, who had never thought of herself as someone with unusual capabilities in the relevant sense, but who was beginning to understand, in the light of what Elias was telling her about the Voss line's history and the political structure of the world he had operated in, that the quality of presence she had always had with frightened animals was not simply an accumulated professional skill. It had a source, and the source had a name in his tradition, and the name translated, roughly as the one who meets things without armor, which sounded more romantic than it was. It was a real and specific capacity, the ability to be genuinely present in the space of another being's experience without the defensive layering that most people interposed between themselves and the full weight of what another being was. And it was rare enough in his world that it had its own vocabulary, and it was the reason, he told her carefully, that the curse had been vulnerable to her, specifically in a way it would not have been vulnerable to most other people. "So I'm not just a person who's good with animals," she said. "You are a person who is good with animals," he said. "You are also more than that. The 2 things are not separate. The capacity is the capacity, whether it manifests in a veterinary context or in the breaking of an ancient curse." She absorbed this information with the same focused attention she had applied to everything else. "Okay," she said. "That's useful to know." He looked at her. 3 weeks into the human form, he was still adjusting to the experience of looking with human eyes rather than the tiger's, the narrower bandwidth but greater depth of focus, the way human faces were legible in ways that required a different kind of attention. Her face was telling him that she was deciding something. "Maya," he said. "We need to address Roan before he addresses us," she said. "But we need to do it in a way that doesn't just remove him from the board. Removing him from the board would destabilize the structures he's built in ways that affect a lot of people who aren't Roan. And what we want is not to destroy the structure, but to replace its foundation. The structure was built on the suppression of the Voss line's influence. Rebuilding the Voss line's presence in a way that makes the structure accountable, rather than secret changes what the structure is capable of from the inside." He was quiet for a moment. "That is," he said, "a sophisticated reading of a complicated political situation that you have been aware of for less than 3 weeks. Is it wrong?" "It is not wrong," he said. "It is in fact the approach I would have taken if I had been in a position to take any approach before. The difference is the timeline. To rebuild the Voss line's presence in the relevant networks in a way that neutralizes Roan's ability to act against us before he acts against us requires 12 to 18 days, Maya said. "If we involve Councilwoman Okafor for the municipal record irregularities, and Jameson for the network reintroduction, and Dr. Reyes for the documentation of your medical situation in terms that will hold up in the contexts where documentation is required. 12 days if everyone is available immediately. 18 if we're working around schedules." Elias looked at her. The gold eyes in the human face were exactly as direct and full as they had been in the other form, and they were looking at her with the expression he had first worn when she sat down in the enclosure and looked at the beetle and did not perform anything. The expression of something that has found something it did not expect to find, and is adjusting all of its assumptions accordingly. "Who are you?" he said. "I'm the person who sat in your enclosure for 3 weeks until you decided to trust me," she said. "I'm the same person I was then. I'm just in a context where more of what I am is relevant." "Yes," he said. "And the way He said it was the way he had said her name on the night the curse broke, with the weight of everything it had been carrying. And it meant, in this context, something larger than agreement. The 12 days were more complicated than the plan, because the plans that involve real people and real political situations always are, and they were also marked by the particular intensity of two people discovering each other in the fullness of what they were, which is a process that does not fit neatly, alongside the practical work of political maneuvering, but which cannot be separated from it, because who you are doing the difficult work with and how you see each other while you are doing it changes what the work becomes. Councilwoman Okafor was willing, cautious, and strategic. She asked the right questions and received the honest answers, and processed them with the equanimity of someone who had encountered the adjacent world before and had made her peace with the fact of it. The municipal records investigation she initiated was procedural in form and consequential in effect, establishing a documentation trail that made the Harrow Park enclosure's irregular history visible in official terms, and creating accountability for who had placed what in those records and why. Jameson was invaluable in ways that Maya had expected and in ways she hadn't. He knew the relevant networks, could identify who in Roan Ashford's alliance was there by conviction, and who was there by proximity and convenience, could reach the second category with communications that established a new option alongside the existing one. He operated with a fluency in the space between the ordinary world and the adjacent one that suggested a history Maya had never had the occasion to inquire about, and she noted it for a future conversation. Dr. Reyes provided documentation that was, in the specific context where it needed to circulate, unimpeachable. The documentation established that Elias Voss was alive and present and in reasonably good health given the circumstances, which was more significant than it sounded in the relevant context, because a key element of Rowan's structural security was the assumption by most parties that the Voss line's primary heir was either dead or permanently inaccessible. The uncertainty that accompanied the evidence of his continued existence created a different calculation for everyone who had been operating on the assumption of his absence. Roan moved on day 9. Maya had expected this, had included it in her timeline as the point at which her calculations would be tested against the real situation, and she had prepared for it in the specific way that she prepared for difficult animal encounters, by remaining very still and very present and trusting that the preparation she had done would hold. 2 of Roan's people came to the park. Not the careful surveillance group from before, but operational personnel, people who came with the specific purposefulness of people who have been given a task that is not primarily one of observation. They found the north enclosure empty, because Elias had not been in the north enclosure since the curse broke, had been staying at Maya's apartment in the careful reconstruction of a life that had been suspended for 3 years and 4 months, and they found instead Jameson and 2 members of the initiative's staff and a documentation team that Councilwoman Okafor had arranged, all of them entirely, legally and entirely publicly present, recording the condition of the enclosure and its history and the irregularities in its municipal record with the calm thoroughness of people who know exactly what they are doing and why. The operational personnel assessed the situation for approximately 4 minutes and then left. Maya, watching through the park's external camera feed on her laptop from her kitchen table, noted the departure and said, 12 days. Elias, who had been standing behind her, looking at the same screen, said, 11. She looked up at him. He was looking at the screen with an expression she was learning, the specific configuration of his face when he was experiencing something that he had not expected to experience, something that revised his understanding of what was possible. We still need to have the direct conversation with Roan, she said. I know, he said. I have been thinking about that conversation for a very long time. What does it look like? She said. Different from what I imagined in the enclosure, he said. In the enclosure I had more anger than I have now. What I imagined was mostly shaped by the anger. He was quiet for a moment. What I want now is different. I want the information that Roan holds to be no longer useful as leverage, which this, he gestured at the laptop screen, has substantially accomplished. I want the people who were operating in the structure he built to have an alternative understanding of the situation, which Jameson has substantially accomplished. And I want Roan to understand that the option available to him is cooperation, and a transition that acknowledges the history without requiring a reckoning that destroys the structure, or continued obstruction that will produce consequences he currently has the capacity to avoid. You want to offer him a way out, Maya said. I want to offer him a way forward, he said. There is a difference. The way out suggests that he escapes. Accountability. The way forward requires that he acknowledge what happened and participate in a transition that repairs the damage. These are not the same thing. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, You've been thinking about restorative justice. I have been thinking about what my line stood for, he said carefully. Before Roan's project, what the Voss Alliance was built on was not simply power in the extraction sense. It was accountability. The relationship between the supernatural community and the human networks that knew about it was built on a framework of mutual accountability, which is what Roan's operation destroyed when it replaced the Voss presence with a structure based on information asymmetry and the management of threats. I don't want to rebuild the Voss presence by becoming what destroyed it. I want to rebuild what actually worked. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I want to come to the meeting with Roan. Maya, he said. I know what you're going to say, she said. That he's dangerous, and that my presence complicates the dynamic, and that there are ways this conversation could go badly that my presence makes worse. All of those things are true, he said. They're also not the full picture, she said. The full picture is that the quality you described as my capacity, the one that broke the curse, the one your tradition has a name for, is also relevant in the context of a difficult conversation with someone who has been operating from a position of convinced superiority for long enough that the conviction has become structural. I'm not going as protection. I'm going as... She paused. I'm going as what I am, the same way I came into your enclosure as what I am. He looked at her for a long time with the gold eyes that were always direct and full, and then he said, Yes. The meeting with Roan took place in a neutral location that Jameson arranged, a conference room in a building that belonged to a law firm. That handled matters on both sides of the world's border, the kind of space that communicated without words, that what happened in it existed in the context of a framework larger than any individual party's power or preference. Roan arrived with 2 people, which Maya registered as a choice about the kind of meeting he intended to have. Enough to communicate that he was not alone. Few enough to communicate that he was not there for a confrontation. He was exactly what the photograph had communicated and more. The absence of legible expression was more present in person, more active, more clearly a cultivated management tool. And Maya looked at it the way she looked at the behavioral patterns of frightened animals, as information about the interior state that the exterior was organized to conceal. What she saw underneath the absence, in the specific configuration of his stillness and the specific quality of his attention as he assessed the room, was something she had seen before. She had seen it in animals that had been through serious trauma and had built their survival architecture around the prevention of future vulnerability. The construction was different. It was more sophisticated, more thoroughly maintained, more deeply integrated with his sense of self, but the foundation was recognizable. She sat down across from him without the armor of professional distance, without the management of an impression. She sat down as herself. She watched him register. This in the fractional adjustment of his attention toward her, and she sat in it and let it be what it was. Elias spoke with the precision and calm of someone who had been holding this conversation in waiting for a very long time, and had moved past the versions of it that were shaped by anger into the version that was shaped by clarity. He established facts. He established what had been done, and what it had cost, and who had paid those costs, and in what specific ways. He established the current situation, the documentation that now existed, the network that had been provided with accurate information about the history, the political reality that Roan was now operating in, as compared to the political reality of 3 weeks ago. And then he offered the choice, not framed as a threat, and not framed as magnanimity, framed as the honest presentation of 2 available paths and their respective consequences. Roan was silent for a long time. He looked at Elias, and then he looked at Maya, and she met his gaze with the same quality of presence that she brought to everything, the same full reception without demand, and she watched him sit in it, the way the animals sat in it when she arrived in their enclosures, and she watched him encounter something in it that his architecture of absence had not prepared him for. He said finally, "I did not expect the curse to break." "I know," Elias said. "I assumed—" Another pause. "The parameters I was given for the curse suggested that the conditions for breaking it were sufficiently unlikely to be effectively permanent." He looked at Maya again. "I was given incorrect parameters. In some respects, yes," Elias said. Roan was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, "The transition will take time. The relationships I have with the human contacts in the network are not relationships that can be transferred by announcement. They are built on trust that is personal, that will need to be rebuilt with you before it is useful." "I understand that," Elias said. "I will need assurances about the framework," Roan said, "about what accountability looks like in practice. I am not opposed to accountability in the abstract. I am cautious about what it means in implementation." "That is a reasonable position," Elias said, "and it is the beginning of a conversation we can have." Maya looked at Roan Ashford, who had just agreed to participate in the conversation that would dismantle the structure he had built on someone else's. Destruction. And she saw in the quality of his stillness, not the satisfied stillness of a threat that has been contained, not the defeated stillness of someone who has run out of options, but something more complex and more human than either. The stillness of someone who has been seen in a way they did not expect to be seen, and is encountering, cautiously and with significant remaining defenses, the possibility that what follows from being seen does not have to be what has followed from it in the past. She did not say anything. It was not the moment for words. She sat in the quality of what was present and let it be what it was, and she looked at Elias across the table, and he looked at her, and the gold of his eyes across the neutral conference room and the November light coming through the windows carried the weight of everything they had been in the enclosure together, the patience and the distance, and the slow fracturing of the architecture that had kept him isolated, and it carried the new weight of what they were now, which was building and was not yet named in the way that things that are still building do not yet need names, but have the quality of names, the quality of something that is becoming itself fully. Please subscribe to the channel before you continue reading. I want to make sure you're here for what comes next. Every new subscriber is a reason this story gets to reach more people, and this story deserves to reach every person who needs it. Epilogue. 6 months later, the north enclosure at Harrow Park was still standing. The initiative had completed its work at the park, and most of the other enclosures had been repurposed. The building that housed the former administration offices had become a community space maintained by a local wildlife conservation group, and the old signage had been replaced with new signage that told a different version of the park's history, a version that acknowledged the neglect and the irregularities without, erasing them, that said, "This happened here, and we are responsible for it, and here is what responsible looks like going forward." The north enclosure specifically had been designated as a protected natural space, documented in city records under the real name and the real history, with a plaque outside the safety perimeter that Maya had written, and that said, in its entirety, "Some places hold things that need to be held." This was one of them. Elias had been in the world for 6 months, which was long enough to have accomplished a significant fraction of what needed to be accomplished, and not nearly long enough to have accomplished all of it. The Voss line's presence in the relevant networks had been re-established in a form that was more visible and more accountable than the form it had taken before, by design, rather than by accident. Elias had made choices, in the reconstruction, that reflected what he had thought about in the enclosure for 3 years and 4 months, and that reflected, he would have said if you asked him, the influence of someone who had shown him what presence without armor looked like in practice. The accountability framework that the Voss line had originally been built on had been restored and then extended, applied to the human-supernatural relationship in ways that addressed gaps in the original structure that the original structure had been too focused on its own preservation to address. Roan Ashford had participated in the transition with a consistency that exceeded what Elias had expected, and that Maya had quietly predicted, in the way she sometimes predicted things that she had read out of a situation's interior texture before they were visible on the surface. He had not become someone different. The architecture of absence was still present, still operating as a management tool in the contexts where he deployed it. But he had become someone in relationship with accountability rather than in opposition to it, which was different enough to matter for the purposes of the transition, and was, Maya had said, enough. You did not need people to become entirely different. You needed them to expand the definition of what was possible within themselves. The rest followed from that, at whatever pace it followed. Maya had, in the course of 6 months, developed a second professional practice that ran alongside the veterinary work, and that had no official name and was not going to develop one, which was the practice of being called by people in the adjacent world who had situations involving animals, or people who were not exactly what they appeared, and who needed someone who could be present with those situations in the specific way that she was able to be present. She went where she was needed, and she sat down and she was what she was without armor, and things shifted. She was not certain yet about the full shape of what this practice was, or where it was going, but she was not in a hurry to be certain, because she had learned, in the North Enclosure in October and November, that the most important developments prefer to arrive in their own time. Elias, who had spent 3 years learning the particular wisdom available in conditions of profound patience, understood this about her without needing it explained. He understood a great many things about her, now that he had had 6 months to understand in full human context, in the context of daily life and disagreements, and the discovery of mutual preferences, and the slow revelation of interior landscapes through the act of sharing space consistently over time. He understood that she was braver than she knew herself to be, that the lack of self-consciousness about her courage was part of what made it effective. He understood that her practical mindedness and her emotional depth were not separate qualities, but were 2 expressions of the same root capacity, which was the capacity to take things seriously in proportion to what they actually warranted, no more and no less. He understood that she had saved his life in a sense that exceeded the clinical meaning of the phrase, had saved it not from death, specifically, but from the particular kind of unlife that the curse had been designed to produce, and that was in some ways a worse outcome than death. He understood, most importantly, that what they had was not the product of the curse's terms, was not an artifact of the magic that had shaped the circumstances of their meeting, but was the thing itself, the recognition, the decision, the connection that had assembled itself in an abandoned enclosure through patience and offered meat, and a hand pressed to a cold ground in November, and 3 words said in a voice that meant what it said, and nothing more than what it said. I am here. On a morning in April, 6 months after the curse broke, and almost 7 months after Maya sat down in the center of the enclosure and looked at the beetle on the ground, they stood together at the edge of the Harrow Park North enclosure in the spring morning light. And Elias looked at the space that had held him, the trees that had grown up in it, the water feature still running, the terrain that had formed itself around the years of his inhabiting it, and Maya stood beside him with her shoulder against his arm, and neither of them said anything because the morning was saying everything that the moment required. He had carried her presence in that space for 3 years and 4 months before she came, in the form of a memory of a child in a red coat that he had not known was a memory of her, had not known until she walked through the door and something in his animal awareness said this specific person, and the recognition was the first real thing that had happened to him in the enclosure, the first thing that warranted the weight of that word. He had never told her about the red coat, about the memory of a small girl that he had been carrying for 25 years, without knowing that it would become a woman with dark, steady eyes and a quality of presence that would break an ancient curse and change the shape of his life. He was going to tell her. He was waiting for the right morning, and he had learned, in the North Enclosure in October, the value of waiting for the right morning, the specific quality of things that arrive at the right time versus things that arrive because we can no longer bear to wait. He looked at her in the April light, and she looked at him, and the gold of his eyes in the morning was exactly the color it had always been. The color seen through fire, lit from a source that fire had not originally been expected to illuminate, and she looked at it with the same dark, steady gaze she had turned on him on the first morning and every morning since, the gaze that said, "I have decided something about you." And she said, in the voice that carried what it carried, "Ready?" He took her hand. It was the same hand she had pressed to the cold ground in November, the same hand he had pressed his head into. And it was warm now in the April morning, and he held it with the care of someone holding something they have waited a very long time to be able to hold in the right form. "Yes," he said, and they walked away from the enclosure together, into the spring morning that was doing everything spring mornings are supposed to do. The light coming through new leaves, the air carrying the specific intelligence of a season that knows what follows from winter, and the park held behind them the shape of what had happened in it, the patience and the silence and the long work of trust, the fault line and the fracture, and the moment when what had been ice found the temperature at which it became water, and the plaque on the fence read what it read, and the water in the north enclosure ran as it always had, as it had been arranged to run, as it would continue to run, a small persistent movement in a space that had held enormous things, and released them, finally, into the morning. Thank you so much for staying with this story all the way to the end. If something in it reached you, the patience, the recognition, the idea that the right presence can break what seemed unbreakable, leave me a comment below telling me which moment hit hardest for you. Was it the first evening in the enclosure? The night she put her hand on the ground? The moment the curse broke? I read every single comment, and this community is why these stories keep getting made. If you're new here, subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next. There are more stories like this one waiting to be told, and they all belong to you.